you, Katarina. My name is Murtagh, and I am a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Galway, and I work solely on the Ruralisation project, and I've worked on ruralisation since the start of this 4-year project. So we're just coming to the final months at the moment. I just share my screen, and for today. That's okay, everybody can see. Okay.
Yes,
perfect.
that's fine.
Great. For today, I'm going to talk about the idea of kind of the rural regeneration process. And what I wanted to do is explore and tease out the concept of regeneration. And this is part of kind of our teamwork in the University of Galway, along with Dr. Maura, Farrell and Louise, Weir. That we have been working on, and it's kind of emerges from our work on the conceptual framework for ruralisation, but we're kind of trying to push things a step further. And what I'll do today is present kind of our preliminary thinkings on how we might conceptualize regeneration and bring the concept forward. And then for the final few minutes, I just want to touch on some of our case study and a wider work within ruralisation that looks at this new generation's perspective. So it kind of gives us a lens to try and understand how this theory might apply in practice. So what I'll do is give you a quick introduction to ruralisation and the University of Galway's role. Also then I'm going to kind of very much focus on the question of rural decline and regeneration, and make the case for more attention to this specific concept of regeneration. And I'll present our, I suppose, preliminary working exploration of the concept. So it's great to get this chance to put this out there at this stage, and to hear your thoughts and questions would be so welcome. So what we've done so far, we have kind of identified a number of categories, subcategories within rural regeneration, but also trying to tease out the process of how regeneration happens. And finally, as I said, I'll bring this back kind of to a little bit of a more grounded approach and talk about the implications in terms of this kind of new generations perspective. So I guess ruralisation has been focused on, I suppose, the issue of demographic decline in rural areas, and this broader question of encouraging and attracting new generations to rural areas. So what is this ruralisation project all about? So we're coming towards the end. The project started in 2019 and will finish early next year, and it's funded through the Horizon 2020 programme. We've 18 organisations across 12 countries. And broadly, I suppose our ambition has been to generate new knowledge to support this kind of, I suppose this is the narrative underpinning the project around engineering a kind of shift away from the spiral of rural decline to create this new positive spiral of rural opportunities. And very much this is focused on opportunities for new generations, and that we can potentially generate knowledge to encourage more young people to move in and less move out of rural areas, that this generates a relative younger population and renews the population. And this in turn has kind of a self-reinforcing positive spiral effect where there are more economic opportunities, and this reinforces the further opportunities for new generations. So this is the grand idea behind the project. And what we did in terms of our grounded work was focus on new generations from a number of different perspectives. Two key areas here, we did a lot of kind of foresight work that looked at future trends and the future visions that young people held in terms of the future that they identified for themselves in rural areas. And the other side, kind of broad approach of the project, was to look at this idea of promising practices. And so we did a series of case studies around rural newcomers, a very diverse group, from international to internal migration in rural areas. Very much we were focused on farming and new generations and generational renewal as well. So we looked at two groups, new entrants to farming and farm succession, and also the broader, I suppose, huge challenge for the new entrants and the successors, this question of how to access land for farming. So we have a range of outputs and reports available on the website at the moment, and still more to add, but I guess there's plenty of research there if people wanted to dig into any of the specifics of the project that I've outlined there. And in terms of University of Galway's role in the project, we this was worked across the primary research, but we also played a key role in leading the work on concepts and kind of conceptual framework development. So that kind of circular graphic that you saw on the previous slide was our starting point, I guess, for this idea of ruralisation. But we needed to kind of tease this out a bit more, kind of try to find concepts that could help us to understand the how question of this process. And we identified, I suppose, 4 key concepts, one being that a process of regeneration is key to leading to generational renewal, to leading to this identification and exploitation of new opportunities for rural areas. And then we very much identified innovation and resources, or different types of capitals, as key to potentially the innovation of to solve the rural issues, or be the sources of these new opportunities, and the capitals in terms of providing the capacities to harness the innovation. So they were kind of 2 key concepts that underpinned our broad idea of how ruralisation might work. And the final idea that we had underpinning ruralisation was around resilience. And this ruralisation process is about kind of a cycle that hopefully self-reinforces and continues. So we identified kind of the broad, I suppose, the broad thing, very broad thinking within resilience, that anything, any process, any initiative, we should be looking at it from this broad kind of more metaphorical idea of resilience, that regeneration should be sustained, should be resilient, should be something that can renew itself. And so that was our initial standpoint on ruralisation and how this would happen. And we kind of very much realised as well that ruralisation is quite I suppose a new idea. We kind of thought this is a preliminary framework as well. We couched our conceptual approach as guidelines, and these could be reshaped, new ideas introduced, led by our findings. And one thing we identified particularly as well from the kind of concept review we did was that rural regeneration in itself is a concept that perhaps needs a bit more work in terms of unpacking it and making it something that's more readily aligned and understood through practice. So this kind of brings me to the focus of the clear focus of today's presentation, which is around rural decline and regeneration. And for the next few moments, I'll just kind of outline how we started out in ruralisation thinking and understanding regeneration, and the particular issues that we identified that needed further work. So from our concept work, we very much kind of identified some fundamentals around what regeneration is, and a clear need to distinguish regeneration from development, that regeneration is not about this idea of redevelopment, that development signals something that's this broad process of change or modernisation. But regeneration may work in a similar way to change or modernize, but essentially it's addressing decline. So it's responding to the specific problems of decline, be it economic, social or demographic decline in rural areas. So there's, I suppose, in the literature on regeneration and rural development, there is a kind of a clear argument there that we need to be quite clear about the distinction between regeneration and development. And then this idea of decline was something that we tackled. What exactly does this mean? Simply, we might understand it as downward trends like declining population, or undesirable trends like maybe the more negative impacts of things like globalization on rural areas. But also very clear from kind of the existing research and work in this area was that decline is hugely multifaceted, and that the different aspects can influence each other. That perhaps it's the economic decline that leads to the demographic decline, or the economic and the environmental decline, and can come into conflict. Also very much that specific decline issues are in themselves hugely complex. If you think about this demographic or population decline in rural areas, it can have an age dimension, that there's a declining youth population. It can have a gender dimension, that perhaps there's more outmigration of women from rural areas due to the opportunities that are available. Or also, in particular rural areas, it could be that there's a kind of transient population, that either an area with strong tourism that sometimes has a strong influx of population at particular times of the year, that can lead to, I suppose, issues around development and decline. So decline is something that, as we tease it out, it's a kind of hugely complex area. And then when you link this, and this could be decline in any context, but when you link it into the wider rural development debate, you've kind of got these, I suppose, key learnings that rural development very much bases its approach on, that we need to recognise the diversity of rural places, and that different rural places, be they remote to places close to cities, hold different opportunities and challenges. And even within that, the remote rural area can present a very different local context. So we do need this kind of place-based approach in terms of dealing with the decline and the subsequent regeneration interventions that emerge. So I guess this picture of decline paints, I suppose, a picture of how regeneration should be structured, and creates quite a challenge for regeneration. So regeneration then, leading on from the nature of decline, should be something that's multidimensional and integrated, that develops kind of these mutually supportive measures, responding to the different dimensions of decline, be it social, cultural, environmental. And it taps into this idea of kind of holistic and integrated development, that we need to look at all the facets of the rural issues and the particular challenges of rural decline, and that ideally regeneration should be supporting multiple dimensions at the same time, be it social, cultural or environmental. And that in regeneration as well, there's a different, I suppose, extent of the type of change that regeneration aims to create. It may aim to, I suppose, revive rural places, go a bit further to reinvent them, or it may be something that's trying to aim for greater transformation, this idea of profound remaking. and kind of find the new frontiers of kind of positive rural development. So this is kind of the narrative that we identified in terms of what regeneration should do. But then we kind of identified as well that it's quite ambitious. There's a lot of kind of narrative there. Maybe the process isn't so clear in terms of the theoretical underpinnings. And what we're trying to do now is kind of develop maybe a more clear, pragmatic framework that can underpin the concept of regeneration in a rural context. And this, I guess, is a potentially huge area. And for now, I guess, and what I'll present today is very much hopefully going to open a discussion around what rural regeneration is and how the process works. Also, I guess, some further justification for why it's important to focus on rural regeneration. I suppose a lot of the rural development issues do link to the problem of decline. If you think of this wider concept of rural shrinkage and declining populations, and the broader problem of generation renewal in farming that has, I suppose, the economic and the farm viability dimensions, that the profession is perhaps not as attractive to younger generations. So these are kind of, I suppose, key issues that link to rural decline, and that are also very much on the policy agenda. The long-term vision for rural areas, a key strand in that is around this demographic issue and rural shrinkage, the common agricultural policy, generational renewal, a key objective there. So I guess regeneration and understanding decline and a focus on that is important from this policy and key rural issue perspective. And then there's an argument, I suppose, that we need to kind of reshape rural to overcome decline. And in some of the literature as well, it's kind of, I suppose, argued that perhaps rural decline is something that's inevitable. So if this is the case because of kind of wider transformations in terms of moving away from industrialization and progressing onto the knowledge economy, well, that even makes the need to dig deeper into regeneration even more important. And there's, I suppose, wider argument there as well that this fundamental point for the need for greater theoretical development, and that there has been more focus given to regeneration in the urban context than the rural. So there's lots of scope here for digging deeper. And the next thing, I guess, to do this, we were asking ourselves was how do we tease out this regeneration concept? And what we very much have done is look to other concepts that can help us to tease out the process and types of regeneration. And very much what we have done so far is to look at the idea of resilience. And some of, I guess, the narrative that exists around regeneration, it does speak a similar language to the idea of resilience thinking. So a fundamental part of resilience thinking is this idea of the ability to react and respond to change. And I guess decline is a particular type of change. And then within resilience thinking, we also have the idea that it's about how systems cope with change, and these can be severe shocks to less severe disturbances. And I suppose these kind of, we can think about these disturbance forces in rural areas as all the wide trends that kind of influence rural change and decline. And also in terms of the regeneration narrative, there's a question there around the extent of change. Is it restoring to a pre-decline level, or is it actually transforming and changing? So these ideas in resilience thinking around bouncing back or bouncing forward. very much speak a similar language to the ideas that we see discussed in how the current status of development of the concept of regeneration and how that exists. Again, resilience is a concept that is well used, but I think one of its kind of key advantages is that it's argued it's a bridging concept, that it's quite malleable, and it does help to kind of reframe the rural development debate. Some would say with very much a focus on the environment that is absolutely, I suppose, critical in terms of how our society and the challenges it faces now. And it has the potential, because it is, I suppose, a huge area of theory, to open up new perspectives and reframe the rural development debate around kind of key challenges we face. And within wider, I suppose, rural development thinking, it's identified that there's a range of trends impacting rural change. And within resilience as well, there would be an acknowledgement that there's a key range of disturbance forces, if you want to call these trends disturbance forces, that impact rural change, rural decline and rural development, but also that this is something that is impacted externally, and that rural areas are connected over long spaces in our economy and society, and that networks are a key important part of the approach in terms of rural regeneration. So it kind of, resilience links into some of the wider discussion in rural development around what is impacting rural areas and rural decline, and how we should think about rural development as something that's not just controlled locally, and that has interconnections across time and space. Also, in terms of the regeneration concept and resilience, there's this idea that resilience very much depends on capacities in terms of local places, in terms of the resources that these places and people hold, that it could be internal resources or that are existing, or innovation and this idea of creative adaptation. And what we have kind of identified as well is the value of a wider theoretical framework in terms of capital frameworks. And in terms of ruralisation, we drew on this community capitals framework, that sees communities as systems, and identifies how capitals, the stocks, the level of capitals, how they flow and interact with each other. And it's important to understand the direction of change and development in terms of how these capitals flow and interact. And this kind of links into wider, I suppose, arguments in the rural decline and rural development debate. Again, how capacities are hugely important and kind of hold the key to how rural areas evolve and respond to decline. And we need to understand kind of the nature of assets, how local actors use them to create this kind of more resilient and sustainable rural. So that's kind of where we're coming from with our new thinking on rural regeneration. And for the next few minutes, I just wanted to give you an overview of what we have kind of constructed around how we would tease out this concept further. And I'll present a couple of categories and also tease out the process of how rural regeneration potentially happens in practice. So I guess one of our fundamental arguments is that regeneration can take different forms, and it's very important to understand regeneration very clearly in this way, that there isn't just, I suppose, regeneration in one form, that we need to see it as something that's multifaceted in itself. And we have these two broad approaches and then 4 subcategories that we have teased out. And these very much kind of align with, I suppose, the broad area of resilience and the different, I suppose, sub areas within resilience thinking, that there's this equilibrium and multi-equilibrium approach that is about how change happens and what forces impact it. And it sees that maybe there's one key shock or disturbance in the equilibrium approach that influences change and influences the capacity for resilience. So our revival regeneration very much links with that field of resilience thinking, so that it's about restoration and revitalisation. It's not about major, huge shifts and change. But then we kind of move on to another field of resilience thinking, and that is the kind of more evolutionary approach that is about seeing change as something much more complicated, and that's influenced by trends across time and space. But also that is an approach that's trying to create a higher degree of change. So this idea of reinvention and transformation regeneration emerges. And also within this broad kind of categorization of regeneration, we very much identified the idea of integration, that is a difficult, I suppose, a difficult thing to tackle. But that if we see regeneration as having these different forms, we also see that perhaps there's lower integration, so lower acknowledgement of the multidimensional nature of decline in terms of how regeneration attempts to be tackled, to higher levels in the transformation end of the regeneration spectrum. So there's different, I suppose, different degrees of integration in the different types of regeneration, that also results in a different extent of change. So in terms of the restoration, perhaps we're just trying to, if it's population decline, to get to a level of population that was is acceptable, whereas in the transformation approach, you're looking at how demographic, economic, cultural decline may interact and trying to influence all of these factors. So that's our kind of more descriptive approach and initial idea around how we could dig a bit deeper onto what we think regeneration, how it should be unpacked. But also what we want to do is understand the process that underpins potentially all of these types of regeneration in terms of decline and how decline happens. The narrative that's there is kind of around a spiral of decline and how things can spiral downwards or upwards. And within this community capitals concept, you very much have this idea teased out in terms of an idea of spiraling up, and how assets or different types of capital can result in a cumulative causation process that self-reinforces the regeneration. And it's also very important that the flow of assets across capitals happens to allow this spiraling up. That we say increase the stock of one capital through working on another. So that's the idea behind this spiraling up process that can help, I suppose, to unpack how regeneration happens and this idea of a spiral of decline or renewal. Also within this community capitals framework, we have regeneration and the idea of must there be a catalyst that kind of kickstarts this process, and then how do resources come together after this catalyst kicks things off to continue the process. So within this community capitals thinking, there's an idea of perhaps there's a kick-starting and a key capital that helps the spiraling up to start. And there is, I suppose, a thinking there that perhaps it's the more intangible forms of capital that help this process to start, but also it opens up a wider question of, in specific contexts, maybe it is the social and cultural capital, but in some others it may be things like built capital that stimulates and kickstarts the regeneration process. So a key question, I suppose, for practice is what capital should be strengthened in what order, in what circumstances. So a lot of questions that this thinking raises for regeneration and how it might happen. But also in terms of this spiraling up process, it's quite a linear understanding of how change happens, and it doesn't perhaps take into account some of the external trends that influence rural areas. So this brings us back to resilience thinking in terms of adding another layer of how decline and regeneration might happen. The capitals framework very much jumps in at the regeneration starting phase, but theories like adaptive cycles look at, I guess, the whole process of decline to regeneration and how this happens over time and how it's influenced by history, this idea of lock-in, and how places or rural economies could be stuck on certain development paths. So this helps to kind of open up some of maybe the deficiencies in the capital frameworks theory, and how we can layer these maybe ideas on top of each other in terms of how to understand regeneration as a process. Another issue, I guess, is questioning these capitals, these resources and local capacities, and how to kind of enable this upward spiral. There's a lot of unanswered questions there as well. And resilience, again, kind of digs deeper into this, and the evolutionary perspective in particular around how agency and power, relations and networks can influence this capacity to adapt and this potential continuing upward spiral. So this idea of perhaps adaptability helps us here, that looks at all of these kind of the different agency influences, the different networks and relations over time, and how this can influence resilience, regeneration, to effectively respond in the context of all of these complex influences on how the process may effectively roll out. So that's our kind of our starting point on how we might pull this idea of regeneration apart. And this final slide here just tries to bring, I suppose, all of these facets together. So we have our kind of 4 types, and we can see that each, I suppose, aims for a different degree of change. So our restoration and revitalisation are very much focused on emerging from the decline, and revitalisation trying to improve things a little bit, to the reinvention and transformation, looking to emerge from the decline and drive reinvention, or perhaps moving on further from that transformation to drive transformative change. We can see the type of response is quite different. So perhaps responding to single or multiple decline issues, that the regeneration response looks at single to multiple pathways. The integration is low to high, depending on the type of regeneration. And the timescale of interventions might be quite different as well, where there's more short-term to a combination of measures when you look at the transformation approach. And then the process, so perhaps the regeneration is more focused on the catalysts, whereas as we move through and upwards in our regeneration spectrum, there's a focus on catalysts and spirals, and perhaps even looking at how a number of spirals interact together in the reinvention or transformation types of regeneration. So this is very much something we're still working on, but I think have teased out regeneration to some extent here. Still work to do on this, but it does show the depth of a potential when drawing these different concepts into the regeneration debate. And why do this? But fundamentally, I suppose the motivation is to understand better how to approach regeneration in practice, that potentially these different forms come together and can play different roles at different times, that potentially transformative regeneration isn't always appropriate or realistic, and that understanding the process could help us to develop interventions that respond to how decline happens, and develops more, I suppose, empirically based approaches. And that is, I suppose, the next challenge, how to apply this and test it in terms of how regeneration potentially happens in reality. And just for the last few minutes, that's what I wanted to do, is kind of bring us back to reality slightly and look at, again, ruralization and its focus on new generations, and how, with this unpacking of regeneration in mind, to make some kind of broad observations and ask questions about how this theory potentially works broadly, very broadly, in practice. And as I said already, ruralization is very much focused on new generations, youth, the key group, 18 to 30 age group was kind of how we defined that, farm successors, new entrants, again, a complex group. We used kind of a topology to try and understand who these are, and rural newcomers as well, a hugely diverse group. But the focus, I guess, for ruralization in terms of decline and what decline issue, the starting point very much was demographic decline and identifying opportunities for these new generations. But I guess ruralization didn't see this as a standalone single issue, but that leads us to wider questions around economic and social sustainability and environmental sustainability in rural areas as well. So that's kind of, I suppose, a ruralization broad position and where we were coming towards regeneration. And just for the last couple of minutes, I just wanted to talk about some of our research work that we did in the Irish context, and look at this question. We have a case study on newcomers and remote work, and ask ourselves, what type of regeneration strategy might this represent, and is it an effective one? And very much, I suppose, the short answer in terms of our case study that we looked at as remote work as a facilitator for newcomers in rural areas. The answer really, what type, is it depends on the rural area and it depends on the newcomer. So we kind of tried to look at our case study around this idea of spiraling up, and the ability for this to happen is very much impacted by the the rural place and the resources that it holds. Varied things from the landscape and the cultural scene to things like broadband. It also depends on who these newcomers are and what type of rural area they're coming to, what life stage the newcomer is at, and also over time they potentially become more embedded in the rural area. So we can see from, I suppose, this example, there are a number, if you want to think about these catalyzing resources, there are a number of them that can influence newcomers to come to rural areas to remote work. The lifestyle factor is huge, so nature, landscape, culture, a huge driver, but also crucially, physical broadband, housing are absolutely essential resources as well. And we can see some in terms of our case study and the newcomers that would have been part of that. They are engaged locally and they support, I suppose, greater demand for services. They can contribute their skills to the wider rural economy. That results in, I suppose, building this social and cultural capital. So newcomers, in terms of regeneration, they kind of help to present rural areas as both places of production and consumption, that these kind of lifestyle drivers, what emerge for us, are very strong in attracting the remote workers to rural areas, and they can contribute to building capital. But key as well in terms of regeneration and the type of regeneration, it depends on the rural place. It could be more restorative around the population. For a small rural community, a handful of newcomers could be quite transformative in terms of keeping schools open. But if you're talking about a town that's driven by tourism, perhaps there's more questions and issues there around the availability of services and how that kind of catches up in terms of maybe the new population coming in. So the counter urbanization research has raised a lot of these questions already. But again, it's very much the key message that in terms of linking the theory and practice here is that it depends on the newcomer, the place, and the potential effect in terms of more restorative or transformative regeneration. And finally, I wanted to kind of touch on some of the foresight research that we've done in ruralisation. This idea of build it and they will come. We assessed the future dreams of young people that they had for themselves in terms of their future lifestyles and livelihoods, and asked them, do they want to live in a rural area? So the idea is, if we build this future that youth dream for themselves, is this an effective regeneration strategy? So youth can often be driven out of rural areas to pursue opportunities. So we kind of wanted to kind of turn this on its head and say, okay, well, what can keep you in a rural area? And let's try and build policy proposals around this. And just to give a flavour of the type of rural that youth dream of, it's quite traditional. It's around kind of raising families. It's around capitalising on what rural has in terms of landscape, nature, the outdoors. It's also about work-life balance for these young people. In terms of the type of home and locality they want to live in, we very much see the kind of legacy that exists in rural Ireland around the one-off house very much being part of the future dreams of young people. But also, I guess, coming back to the traditional rural idea that it's family friendly, peaceful, quiet, there's strong communities. But I guess as well, access to services is key for these young people. In terms of the livelihood and the job, fundamental things that they want kind of in a job they enjoy, that's rewarding, that there's a comfortable living, that they can earn from it, and some constraints around this cost of living key, and job opportunities. Kind of no surprises there. It speaks to a lot of the broader rural development challenges that many rural areas face. But I guess the point when we come back to the regeneration question is that this, I suppose, vision that young people have is very much within a traditional rural. It's not a transformed rural where there's, I suppose, a diversified, multifunctional rural economy where there's maybe more circular economy, digital economy, entrepreneurship, social entrepreneurship. So we have to ask ourselves, if we build this future that young people want, what type of regeneration does it promote? And similar points, I guess, were made by Stockdale in research over 15 years ago, that it is, young people are key to rural areas, but it's also about what they do when they get there. So at the moment, what we're doing in ruralisation is also bringing a trend research together with this Youth Dream Futures and asking ourselves, okay, what did this trend research tell us about the opportunities? A lot of things in there around social entrepreneurship, eco-villages, circular economy, bioeconomy. So how we're asking ourselves now, if we're to build the youth the dreams that youth have for the rural future, perhaps we need to pick up on some of the, I suppose, the lesser dominant trends that are in there that potentially for this more transformative future. But that's we're trying to tease this out at the moment, and this is some ongoing work. So that's it. I hope that's provided some stimulating food for thought, and really would love to hear what you think, and any questions would be great. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Aisling. It's been really very, very interesting. And as you said, there are really a lot of food for thought and maybe also questions. So we have maybe 10 minutes for a short discussion. As far as the chat, there is no sort of real question, but there is a comment from Joanna that this obviously reflects on her PhD, and there is also a reference that we'll pass on to you. Yeah, Ian, you have a question, so please go ahead.
Hi, Aisling. That was a really interesting talk. Yeah, I'll drop a reference in as well, which might be particularly useful when you're thinking about the agents involved in change, the Trinity of Change theory, which also comes from economic geography theory, which is a lot of what you were talking about. My question was around policy, and whether or not you've come across any interesting examples where policy is kind of helping to try and drive this.
I think what we, I suppose, saw so far was in terms of the existing research, there's, I suppose, is saying that, I suppose, in terms of regeneration and directly interventions that try to target regeneration, they can be quite short term and deal with maybe single or a few issues. But what we tried to do, I guess, in ruralisation was this idea of promising practices. So perhaps these are things that are under the radar that aren't maybe part of the policy agenda. So there's, I think, a huge range of examples there that potentially can be taken forward to plug that gap, to change, I guess, the approach to regeneration from things like, we looked at things like cultural festivals as potentially reinventing rural areas, to things like farm partnerships or the newcomers and remote work that we did in Galway. So I can't say I have a specific answer, but there's, I suppose, a lot of what ruralisation was trying to do was to find the kind of lesser spotted actions and things that are happening in communities that could be part of the future policy agenda. So yeah.
Yeah, thank you very much. And also there is a question from Chris. When you looked at capitals, did you consider natural capital? It is much in the policy discussion now, so its potential for regeneration is worth exploring.
No, I suppose we didn't look directly at natural capital, but it was one of I think the 7 or 8 that are part of the community capitals framework. But I guess in one of our work packages, we focused very much on access to land, and our partners, I suppose, are a multi-actor group, and there's the Access to Land network there that is very much focused on agroecology as an important, I suppose, future approach. And within that, natural capital, I suppose, is a key driver there. So I suppose it was a focus, and how, you know, if we can value and balance the different assets, and agroecology as, I suppose, an important underexploited approach in agriculture. So there definitely would be a lot of case studies there that I think touch on that question of the importance of natural capital, and a more closer focus on it.
Yeah, thank you very much. There is a question from Daniel. Daniel, would you like to ask the question directly?
Hello, how you doing, Ashley?
Hi.
Yeah, no, just on when you talk about bringing in new people, you know, youth or outsiders to regenerate rural areas, one of the issues that I've seen, especially in the local area that I'm working in, has been the hesitancy or reticence of landed owners to, you know, allowing new forms of economic generation. Do you find much in terms of you know, this across the board, or is it just specifically in certain locales?
I guess we, I suppose, had one case study in the Irish context, and I think culturally there definitely is a hesitancy, you know, in terms of welcoming newcomers, but I don't think it's more hesitancy than kind of a lack of acceptance. And I think once they become embedded in rural areas, it helps to overcome that. So maybe from what our case study has told us, hopefully time and people becoming embedded in communities and contributing can help to overcome that. But I guess we very much kind of focused on, I think a lot of the people were they weren't entrepreneurs as such, so it may be, you know, they were more contributing to communities than rather reshape the rural economy. But I think broadly it's an issue that I think from the wider research that we've certainly seen that it is something that hopefully through time can change. But I guess that's an unanswered question that maybe is an important one for regeneration, and where we go next in unpacking that.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. And we have time maybe for last question. So Damien, please go ahead.
Oh, thanks, Katerina. Oh, thanks, Ashley. That was really, really excellent, actually. Very interesting stuff. Well, it's just to flag a few things, really. I mean, one is just to maybe mention the work around social innovation, which might be quite interesting. And I'm thinking also about the work of people like Bettina Bock, who've got, Bettina did a very interesting paper a few years ago on, I think she called it nexogenous development or something like this, which was quite interesting. But it kind of levers into some of that stuff around sort of social innovation. So just to flag that up, and also to flag, you might find our EU project Robust quite interesting, because one of the things that was talking about was actually the relationship between rural and urban places, in the context of, I mean, we weren't talking about regeneration necessarily, but we were talking about kind of, you know, new kind of business models and new kind of growth models. So thinking about synergies between rural and urban places, and not necessarily synergies which were, you know, places that are like next to each other as well. You can think of it in sort of more you know, more relational ways. So that's quite interesting. And then there's a big debate in Dialogues in Human Geography about ruralisation, which you might have come across, but that's quite interesting as well in terms of some of these bigger kind of challenges and encounters and some of the kind of urban planetary stuff. But the thing I was thinking about was this idea of the intervention for regeneration, and I was just interested to get your thoughts really on how that could be done, or how it needs to be done, maybe the scale at which it could be done, but also the mechanisms. So like particularly at the end where you were talking about this, how do you create this more transformative future? I mean, have you guys had any reflections on that in terms of how you try to build that process in a way that is kind of community centered and not kind of top down or sort of patronizing or any of that sort of stuff?
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, no, and I think that's a huge question we're pondering. And what you mentioned around innovation and social innovation, like innovation was something we looked at in ruralisation, and I suppose there's an argument there that it can be thrown up as the solution to everything. But I guess in approaches, we're asking ourselves, you know, how do we define innovation in rural areas, and do we need to expand this, and how do we resource innovation? Is it all about innovation? But I guess it comes back to capacities and skills and human, like the human capital for ruralisation very much came out across a number of the different areas as kind of a key game changer, and to kind of allow people to take control themselves of, be it small businesses or, you know, wider contributing to community change. So I don't know the answer to that question. It's a very interesting one, and I think we need to dig deeper on. But I guess the problem with resilience as well is that it has been criticized for its kind of maybe outward looking, that people are just reacting to change and things are not as proactive as they should be, which again kind of brings us back to the human capital question and people's capacities. But then it's the whole debate of putting too much responsibility on local people. So there's some kind of middle ground there that gets over all the stumbling blocks, that when maybe there's too much focus on people being the change for their own communities. So I don't, yeah, it's very, very interesting one, and thanks Damien for all your suggestions there.
Oh, no worries.
Yeah.
I can send you a couple of papers if you're interested.
Yeah, no, that'd be great. Yeah,
no worries. Great talk, thanks a lot.
Okay, well, thank you very much. So I am afraid we'll have to stop here because we are running out of time. But thank you again, Aisling, for a very interesting and thought-provoking talk. I hope this is just, you know, the beginning of maybe more a longer-term conversation. And thank you everyone for joining us. As this is the last seminar, on behalf of all of us, I would like to sort of wish you really a Merry Christmas and a very Happy New Year. And we hope to see you next year. So thanks a lot, and goodbye in 2023.
And thanks everyone for your insights and questions. Very helpful. Thank you.